Well, friends, our scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to John, chapter 1, verses 10 through 18. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks ahead of me because he was before me.' From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known." Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Well, one of the things that I always like to follow is social media discussions, and so I tend to spend most of my time on Facebook because I'm old, and so that's where I engage in them. And one of the questions that I have seen going around lately is a pretty simple one. It's just a simple discussion starter. Who's the most famous celebrity you have met? Now, I have to admit, I've got the opportunity, had the privilege of meeting a fair number of celebrities. The most famous one in terms of worldwide fame was I once ran into Muhammad Ali at the airport in Chicago, at O'Hare Airport, and I got his autograph, got to shake his hand, and I got to tell you, that is the largest, most powerful hand I have ever felt in my life, okay? I mean, it literally was like shaking hands with a ham, okay? I mean, it was a big, heavy hand. I guess that's what comes with what he did for a living. But the thing is, I've met celebrities in different circumstances, and some of the encounters were good and pleasant, and they seemed like really nice people, and some of them were less than pleasant and seemed very much wanting to make sure that I knew how rich and famous they were, and so the encounters varied differently. But no matter what, these were brief encounters, and so, there's no way that I can say that I really knew them, right? I met them, but I don't know them in any way, shape, or form. Now, and our passage today has the Gospel of John talking about how we come to know God. All right? It says, he was in the world, and the world came into being through him, talking about God, yet the world did not know him. The world knew of God, but they didn't know him, okay? And this leads to one of the simple questions that we encounter fairly often, which is, what defines knowing someone? What does it mean to know someone? I mean, you can meet someone, you can meet them over and over, but for example, one of the things that has happened to me in my life, not that often, but a person says, "Oh, do you know so-and-so?" And you can sit there and say, "Oh, yeah, I've seen them a number of times. A bunch of us went out to dinner and the person was there, or I've been to parties with them," or something like that. And then the person says something like, "They applied for a job at my company. Do you think we should hire them?" And it's like, oh, okay, that's a whole different level of whether I know the person. All right? Do I know them to the level where I'm ready, to stake kind of my personal reputation on whether they're a good person? I can say, "Oh, we've had perfectly pleasant interactions. Oh, we've had wonderful discussions. Oh, they didn't do anything hugely embarrassing in our time together," that kind of thing. But do I know them enough to recommend them for a job? Do I know them enough to trust them for a deal? Would you trust your kids to be babysit by that person? Okay? That's a whole different level of knowing someone. And yet what our passage is talking about today is the opportunity to come to know God that was made manifest in Jesus Christ because the Word became flesh and lived among us. Because knowing someone takes time. spending a lot of time with them, and most importantly, like seeing them in the everyday. All right, like one of the questions you'd often have in the discussion groups was, if you could invite some figure from history to dinner, who would it be? And you might say, oh, Abraham Lincoln would be a great dinner guest, or Martin Luther King, or whoever it might be. But even then, it would just be a dinner, it would just be a discussion. What does it mean to come to know them? I'd need to spend a lot of time with them. I'd need to be with them in places where the world wasn't watching them. I'd want to see little things like if we just go grab lunch, go just, casually, how do they treat the wait staff? Are they decent tippers? And I mean, not to be showy. I mean, there are people who, there are some celebrities who are wealthy and they throw their money around extravagantly, and it's clear that they're not being generous to be generous. They're basically wanting the people to scramble and follow them and be really, obsequious to them because of the money, as opposed to just being nicely kind. By the way, on that, I just want to let you know, in case you weren't aware of this, Christians have a terrible reputation as tippers. They just do. Okay? Just if you know somebody who's been a server, just ask them how they feel if a church group comes in on Sunday afternoon. And you will come to know exactly what our reputation is. It's not a good look. It's not a good look. And I've actually heard preachers preach on this. It's not a good look that actually damages the cause of Christ. Because you go out into the world in an ordinary situation, you need to show generosity. You need to show kindness. Okay? What does it look like when a group of Christians goes out there and they're pretty, vocal about the fact that they are a Christian group, that they're a church group, all right? And they're all about love and grace, unless the food's 5 minutes late, or the bill is off by 50 cents. Because that's how you learn who people really are and what they're really about and the principles that really drive them. See what John writes, he says, the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And these were not separate things. See, people knew the law, but they didn't know how to apply it. They didn't know what it looked like when it was lived out. And that often happens. I mean, we can hear principles. We can hear about, 5 things that you should do to be a better whatever, a better boss, a better partner, a better whatever. But you can hear them and not really understand what it is to live into them. You can botch the living into part. And what Jesus did was he showed them how to live the law. See, Jesus did not change the law. Over and over he said, I am not here to change the law. I am here to fulfill the law. He did not come to change the law, but what he changed was their understanding of how to live the law. He didn't teach classroom style. He taught by how he lived. And that's really the best way that we learn how to do things, because you learn the subtleties. I mean, one of the things that I've always said when we talk about rules is that there's basically, to me, 3 levels of understanding rules. The first level is you don't understand them. So at the first level, you do not understand the rules, you do not understand the law, you don't understand what you're supposed to do. At the second level, you understand them and you follow them. Okay? So you just sit there and say, okay, this is the rule, I'm going to abide by the rule. At the top level, you know the rules so well that you know when they don't apply. And you know when the exceptions need to happen. And you understand how to live into them with the flexibility of the spirit of the law. Jesus did that with Sabbath. He never said, don't observe the Sabbath. And certainly in that time, lots of people did not have any Sabbath understanding, the ones who were not Jewish, okay? And so they said, no, you should have Sabbath. So the people said, all right, we will have Sabbath. We will have Sabbath. We will have Sabbath. And then Jesus, who observed the Sabbath, he also then healed people on the Sabbath. Because he understood that, yes, Sabbath is good. You should take Sabbath. You should observe Sabbath. And then when somebody needs healing, you got to heal them on the Sabbath. He achieved that third level of the law, which is understanding the law well enough to understand the spirit of the law, to know when the rules need to be adjusted, when they need to be flexible. And that's how it is in so many things in life, whether it is the great composers in music who followed along, they followed the rules, except when it got better when they didn't. You want doctors who do that, right? They follow the rules, they give you the medicines that fit your conditions until maybe you've got something a little bit different. They need to adjust it, right? That separates a good doctor from a great doctor. And we learn these things, not through sets of rules, not through sets of, okay, now let's take the rule and put subsection A, paragraph 1. You can't do it that way. You kind of learn it organically, and the way you learn it organically is really through stories, by experiencing it in that story-like way. I mean, for instance, one of the things that does happen is I'll get people who put me down as a reference, a recommendation. They might be applying for a job or a position. And they call you up and they say, hi, we're just doing a reference check on so-and-so. And you pull out your basic, there's like a special thesaurus for giving recommendations. There's 12 adjectives that just get used over and over and over, okay? And so you go, right? And you know what only happens a few times, but it tells me that the person I'm talking to knows what they're doing? You say something like, oh, they're a really good problem solver or something like that. And they go, oh, can you tell me a story about that? Can you give me an example of that? See, that takes it to a different level. Oh, they're really responsible. Oh, can you give me a story about that? Can you recall the time that they went over and above, to be responsible in ways that an ordinary person wouldn't, all right? That's when you really know somebody. That's when you really can get a feel for who they are, is when you can give the example. And by the way, I think that when you write recommendations for people, if any of you are ever asked to do that, include some stories. Don't just say, oh, yes, they are a hardworking, good team player. Say how, say where. They're a great team player. There was this time when, well, I guess these days it's far too common, when half the department got sick. And they stepped up, and they went the extra mile to cover for their friends. Right? That's a different level of talking about a person, when you can back it up with story. I mean, if you talk about a person who's a great friend, you should have a story, many stories, about how they were a good friend to you. We all took a big hit in our society. It was like the coup de grace of 2021 when on New Year's Eve Betty White dies. Right? We were waiting for her to hit 100 in a few weeks. People magazine ran a presumptuous story about her turning 100, and then you get the news alerts on my phone. My phone starts going nuts. It's like, wow. But of all the accolades, and you read about all the shows that she did, here's the story that I heard that I loved. In 1954, she had a variety show. She's one of the pioneering women on television. 1954. This is before Brown versus Board of Education. And she had a young dancer on her show named Arthur Duncan, African American. And she had him on her show multiple times. And stations in the South threatened not to run her show. They said, if you keep inviting him as a guest, we're not going to run your show. And she reportedly responded. This is the story as Arthur Duncan tells it. She responded really simply. She said, well, they can live with it. That's it. She didn't insult them or anything. She just said, I'm just going to do it. They can live with it. It's my show. I'm going to have them as a guest on my show. They can live with it. That story tells me more about her than anything else. You can talk about her career. You can talk about all the wonderful things she did. You can say she was a wonderful person and how people that, she worked with liked her and all this sort of stuff. But basically, that story tells me what I need to know about her. John writes that no one has ever seen God, but his Son made him known. See, we can sense God's presence. We can pray to God. We can feel God's Spirit. But the way we came to know the heart of God is through the life of Jesus. It is in the life of Jesus in the flesh that we come to know the heart of God. And it is through the life of Jesus that we can imagine how God would react to us. For example, I know a lot of people, and I was raised with a lot of this belief, that if you do wrong, God's going to punish you. Right? Maybe some of us, maybe a lot of us were taught this. Maybe some of us still believe this in some way. But you see, when you know the heart of God through Jesus, you can imagine it differently. I'm trying to imagine Jesus coming up to me and saying, you did a bad thing, I'm going to get you. Impossible. I can't imagine that in any way, shape, or form. I can't imagine Jesus saying that to me. No way. At worst, I can see Jesus kind of saying, you knew better, right? And you say, yeah. And Jesus goes, yeah. Let's go have lunch. See, that's the heart of God. And that's how we know the heart of God. So when you imagine how God would react to you, when you imagine how God would treat you, when you imagine how God would care about you, when you imagine how God is listening to you when you are in a tough spot, imagine it is Jesus, the person who came in the flesh to make the heart of God known to us. Because it's through role models that we learn principles. Role models embody principles. All right, you can read about good leadership or whatever, but role models let you feel it, let you experience it. They make principles come to life so that you understand the principles not as an academic exercise, not in your head, but you feel it in your bones because you experienced it. See, what does loyalty look like? You see it in a good friend, a good supervisor. All right. You could say Betty White was a woman of courage and inclusion, but you saw it in the story. What does it mean to be a good parent? This is something that is felt, not defined. I mean, if you ask me about my parents and why I loved my parents, my answer is going to be stories, not adjectives. The stories are where you feel the principles. And in your life, as people have experienced you, and they have stories about you, what principles would they infer you're living by based on their stories. And I'm not saying that any of us does this perfectly well. I mean, I can give you a list of things that I say are the principles that guide my life, and everyone who knows me would be able to come up with at least one solid counterexample where I failed to live up to that. Because that's just the nature of being a fallen human being, right? Okay, that's the nature of being a human who makes a lot of mistakes. But overall, what are people's stories of you? And what do those stories say about how you really are guided in your life? We're at the start of a new year, at the start of a church year. And in the church preaching calendar, you kind of take a gospel sort of, mostly straight through the year. The first few weeks, it begins at Advent, before Christmas. And the first few weeks are naturally about the birth of Jesus, the baptism of Jesus. And it's only in the rest of the year that you get the body of his life. But as we go through the stories of Jesus' life, what I want you to do, what I want you to remember and hang on to during this year, is to immerse yourself in those stories. Don't just separate the words out of what he says. All right? Immerse yourself in the story to feel what it was like to be with him. To see, to feel, to sense how he related to people. See, a couple of things that I always take away from reading the stories of Jesus is that the only time he gets really short with people is people who are being hard on other people. People who are making life tough for others, Jesus has very little patience with. But if you're having a hard time, no matter what you've done, Jesus welcomes you. When you're sad, Jesus is sad with you. Don't just learn about God from what he says. Learn by being with Jesus through the stories and immersing yourself in them so that you're spending the time with him that it takes to really come to know God and know Jesus. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to just know of God. You want to know God through Christ so that if you got the question, the recommendation, can I really trust God? Should I really, really commit myself to the ways of Jesus? You don't want to be that person, like I said at the beginning of the sermon, who says, should I hire this person? You want to be the person who goes, oh, wait a second, I don't know him that well. I've hung out with him a little bit, but I don't really know him that well. You want to be the person who can say yes. And let me tell you some stories about why. The stories I've come to learn in my life about the love of God, the faithfulness of God to me, how forgiven I have felt for what I've done. And that comes when we spend the time that it takes to know God the way we know the closest people to us in our lives. Amen.